BBC. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Hello, I'm Gordon Carrera, the BBC's security correspondent. You're listening to the Bin Laden Tapes on the BBC World Service.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا.
In 1996, in the wilds of Tora Bora in the Hindu Kush, Osama bin Laden recites a supplication before declaring war on America.
وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له.
This now infamous threat against the United States was relayed to the world on a simple audio cassette, the perfect tool for proselytizing and propaganda. Easy to distribute, hard to censor. And this particular recording was bin Laden's own, one of a collection found in Afghanistan following the fall of the Taliban.
These tapes were found in the months following 9/11 in Kandahar, Afghanistan, in bin Laden's former house. He'd been in Kandahar from 1997 through 2001. The house was located directly across the street from the Taliban's foreign ministry and was a very important one for al-Qaeda's top echelons. This was a place for living and meeting right before heading across the street to talk with Taliban officials. So the tapes really here were like a library, an audio library for al-Qaeda operatives, for others who were with them, biding their time, waiting for Taliban meetings.
Flag Miller is Professor of Religious Studies at the University of California, Davis, and the only person to have listened to the entire archive. An expert in Arabic culture and literature, his book, The Audacious Ascetic, explores the contents of the tapes and what they reveal about the evolution of Osama bin Laden's ideology.
When the tapes were originally found, a family in Kandahar, an Afghan family, had found these tapes in bin Laden's abandoned house. Everything else in his house had been ransacked. These tapes were lying in a corner, untouched. And so the family, brought them, and they ended up in a Pashto cassette shop where they were being used really as blanks for songs.
So they were going to be recorded over?
Right.
After the fall of the Taliban, I guess that was allowed again.
That was, bring it on, pump up the volume.
Al-Qaeda's tape library turning into pop music.
Mm-hmm. But a cameraman at CNN, a stringer, learned about the tapes and visited the cassette shop and said, stop, these are of interest to a wider community. And so CNN acquired them.
Eventually, they were sent through to the Afghan Media Project at Williams College in Massachusetts, who brought in Flag Miller to help make sense of them.
There were just over 1,500 tapes, and they were in 2 boxes shipped from Islamabad. They were dusty and jumbled together in just a real hodgepodge of political speeches, sermons, conversations and training camps, commercially produced tapes, and amateur.
Was it a bit overwhelming when you got those boxes of tapes just to think how much could be on there?
Yeah, it was totally overwhelming. I didn't get to sleep for 3 days just thinking about what would be required in terms of making sense of it.
And what period do these tapes cover?
They cover from the late 1960s through 2001.
What's the earliest tape you found which features Osama bin Laden?
Earliest tape is from 1987, from a battle. It's a live audio recording of commanders in Afghanistan speaking in Arabic, include bin Laden. And they're operating from what was known as the Lion's Den, which was the nickname for bin Laden's small camp in Afghanistan. And they're taking on Spetsnaz Soviet commandos, and they're planning a bombing of a warehouse.
How do you know it's Osama bin Laden in that tape?
I've listened to many of bin Laden's tapes. It very much sounds like him. And then at one point, people refer to him as Abu Qaqa, which is a well-known nickname for him.
And Osama bin Laden at this time, in the late 80s, he is one of the leaders of a group of Arabs, isn't he, fighting against the Soviet Union amongst the Mujahideen. How significant is he in that group?
He was from a prominent, wealthy family. So he had money, he could pull strings. Interestingly, though, many of the Arab militants from North Africa and from other countries, as much as they wanted to bring bin Laden into their transnational militancy, they also found him a liability. The Saudis were known for funding, but there were always strings attached. The strings were, don't bring that revolution back home. And bin Laden wanted to create an image of himself as an effective militant. That was not an easy job because he was known as a dandy.
I mean, it's quite interesting that he or someone around him is making a tape of being on the battlefield.
Yes, absolutely. He was very sophisticated at self-marketing. The audio tapes that we find in this collection are very much part of the story, the kind of myth-making that went into giving bin Laden a new face.
What's the earliest speech we get from the collection which features Osama bin Laden?
The first full speech we have of bin Laden is from 1988. He's in Saudi Arabia.
فقل الذي في ذهن الآن كفار أو يهود أو أسلحة متطورة أو كذا.
His main message is one that he frequently hit in those early years, which was support the Afghan jihad, ideally volunteering to go fight, but also giving your wealth in its cause. He frequently comes back to a Quranic verse.
أن تنفروا خفافا وثقالا.
انفروا خفافا وثقالا. Go forth, whether light or heavy, to fight with your wealth as well as your souls. But he translates that in more literal terms for audiences by saying, actually, there's a really overweight Arab militant who came to volunteer for us. His name was Yahya, and he was of Jeddah. And despite being obese, he moved mountains. So he was heavy, but he worked magic on the front lines.
Bin Laden espoused a puritanical form of Islam, which he saw as the real Islam, following in the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad and his disciples. Any deviations from this literalist Sunni monotheism were held with contempt, seen as a threat even.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
What you hear now is the introduction to another speech from 1989, which, it states, is sponsored by the Saudi National Guard's Department of Religious Affairs, a reminder that once upon a time, Osama bin Laden was on good terms with the Saudi establishment and that he had the kingdom's spiritual interests at heart.
What's fascinating, I find, about this speech is that bin Laden is very much talking about the ways that the Arabian Peninsula is threatened. It's under occupation. It is being assailed on all fronts by an enemy.
Our present reality is a very dangerous one. Never before has the Islamic world experienced a time such as this. Look around you.
Who is the enemy? Well, it's not the United States, as we often think, or it's not the West. Rather, it is other Muslims.
Today, disbelief has surrounded the land of the two holy sanctuaries like a bracelet coiled upon a wrist.
They are Shiites, first and foremost, from Iran, and even within the Saudi kingdom itself has a large Shia population. They're Baathists, Iraqi Baathists. They're communists, Egyptian Nasrists.
So the United States and the West is pretty low down the priority list at the moment. He sees much more of the danger within the Muslim world from people who don't support his quite narrow, strict interpretation.
Bin Laden is conveying an early image, I think, that's been lost in much of the later reporting, his sense to kind of bring jihad to the question of who is a Muslim, who is a true Sunni Muslim. There's an urgency in what he says that becomes extremely graphic.
The dismemberment of Muslims has spread across the earth, their blood on every patch of land and field. So much that if the earth defecated, it would find itself constipated from the bulk of blood and body parts.
And then he does a Q&A with the audience, with people, is that right?
There's a question and answer section in the end in which a person asks a question about American funding for the Afghan Mujahideen and whether that compromises the Arab Afghans' cause. Bin Laden, at that point, says, I'm tired. I don't want to respond to this question. And his host speaks up for him and says, well, our good companion here is feeling weary. We might postpone that question for a more convenient time.
Because, of course, it's well known now that there was a huge amount of funding going to the Mujahideen.
That's right.
But very awkward for Osama bin Laden to acknowledge that or admit it at the time.
That's right. Lots of awkward questions.
This 1989 lecture in Saudi Arabia, how widely distributed would something like that have been?
Those early tapes could be disseminated very quickly, very rapidly. Reports are that the tape from 1989 sold in the order of 250,000 copies in the first month alone.
What's the origins of it, that cassette culture?
The cassette culture started in the late 1960s. These were heady nationalist and post-nationalist periods in the Arab world, as the Arab world was shaking off its former colonial occupiers. And the audio cassettes, because they were so user-friendly, could also be circulated off-market and evade the kind of censorship mechanisms that states would normally bring to state media. So audio cassettes could support revolutionary ideas as people talked together on tapes and swapped tapes and made recordings of themselves. So we know actually on some of the tapes in the collection, people wrote a gift to Sheikh Osama, and they would give him a tape saying, hey, why don't you check out this local preacher, or, here's a band of Islamic anthems that we think you might appreciate.
This is one of the tapes. I mean, it's a remarkable mix of singing and dramatizations of battles.
This is one of those Islamic anthem tapes. This is stuff that, for many audiences is the way into jihad, and that is through the heart. It's far more emotional than rational kind of draw. Dramatizations bring home the sounds of combat that many would read about in the papers, they would see on television, but there's something intimate about hearing them in your Walkman. Because there are no images, they really play to your imagination.
How long have you spent listening to all these tapes and transcribing them?
Well, I began listening to these tapes in 2003 and, have been listening to them ever since. Many hours have been spent pouring through these. And, a single tape of, say, 90 minutes can take months just moving through and kind of listening to it over and over, because these are live conversations and in vernaculars and dialects that even for local speakers are sometimes hard to pick up. So these have involved going back to the Middle East, listening with friends there, listening with people actually involved in that conflict in particular, and making an argument about here's the context, here's the kind of things this guy would say.
And you can
That's
date
the
it.
Only mention of any historical moment that I could date it.
Yeah. I mean, some people, when they heard you were going through bin Laden's cassette library, might have thought, is this the kind of stuff he listened to personally? Was it his Phil Collins collection or something like that? Did people ask you that?
Yeah, no, definitely. There were a lot of curiosity as kind of what was the range of bin Laden's musical tastes. It's hard to know exactly which of these tapes he was a fan of. One of the tapes in the collection is Gaston Granaciel, otherwise known as Enrico Macias, an Algerian Jew who was just a terrific singer and migrated to France and became a world celebrity. Most of this tape is a lecture on Palestine. It's about fighting in the occupied territories. And suddenly, in the midst of this political speech, the tape cuts out. And Gaston Granaciel's voice comes in and he's singing about les gens du Nord, working class northerners in France. I think this collection of French songs reveals the extent to which Afghan Arabs in Kandahar, they spoke many languages, they'd had many world experiences, many of them had lived in the West for long periods of time, and it can never be said enough that these militants do have many lives. And these songs suggest, that someone was enjoying this French Algerian Jew and his songs at some point in their lives and may have continued to enjoy them despite other struggles that clearly would have.
That you found?
There are tapes in English, a dozen or so tapes by the New Intercom Company, which was a Boston-based production company that produced language training tapes for folks whose second language was English.
New Intercom 4, Unit 10, a job in Dallas.
Good morning. May I help you? Is it too late to apply for the computer programmer position? No, you can still apply.
These tapes would have been useful for those who wanted to improve their English skills.
Which is slightly bizarre, isn't it? The idea that these jihadis are sitting there in Afghanistan, listening to tapes, trying to teach them how to speak English and talking about trying to get a job in America.
Many of the militants had very transnational backgrounds. And we know that bin Laden spoke English better than he would publicly acknowledge. It's bizarre, though, in the sense that it gives us a little insight into the ways in which, the image of bin Laden and these militants as kind of diehard Arabs who were kind of emerging out of the desert is often seen. That was part of a much more complicated image that they worked to craft and continually maintain.
Going back to bin Laden's own recordings, there's a couple of his speeches in the collection from 1993, so a couple of years after the first Gulf War, when, of course, American troops had been stationed in the Gulf, often seen as the trigger for his fallout with Saudi Arabia and for becoming more anti-American. Do we start to see him in these years around 93 becoming more anti-American?
In September of 1993 is the first time bin Laden speaks publicly on any of these tapes about the dangers of the United States for Muslims. Normally, calling out the dangers of U.S. intervention in the region would have been a great liability for anybody in Saudi Arabia because of intimate U.S.-Saudi relations. Yet he's only able to do so in the wake of the recent announcement of the Oslo Peace Accords that kind of offered possibilities of a long and lasting peace between Israel and Palestine. For Saudis, that's more of an accepted kind of way to critique the U.S. intervention in the region. That's when bin Laden is actually able to kind of first brand himself as being a voice against the U.S.
America won't cease its support of Jews in Palestine who are killing Muslims until we smash them and raise the banner of struggle. What is required is to launch an economic war against America. We must also write to American embassies and consulates to express our condemnation of their criminal acts.
And I think in that speech also, there's even a reference, I think, to Gandhi as an example to follow.
That's right. Gandhi is a significant figure in this speech. He takes on the U.S., but he wants to say, look, how are we going to take on the U.S.? Let's do so through asceticism. And Gandhi, the kind of most renowned figure for the ascetic in the 20th century, could be our role model.
Consider the case of Great Britain, an empire so vast that some say the sun never set on it. Britain was forced to withdraw from one of its largest colonies when Gandhi the Hindu declared a boycott against their goods. We must do the same thing today with America.
So he's still talking about kind of boycotting American goods, writing letters rather than actual violence against the United States, at least in these public speeches.
That changes in 1996, days after he has been exiled from the Sudan. He's been stripped of his Saudi citizenship. That happens in 1994. Under U.S. pressure as well, he's increasingly a dubious international presence and financing terrorist attacks. He's also lost all his money, so he's at his wit's end. So bin Laden's got to come up with something desperate to galvanize his extremist supporters, and that's done in his 1996 speech from Tora Bora.
The copy of the declaration of war from Tora Bora in 1996 that's in the tape collection is different, isn't it, from some of the other versions that people have seen in the past?
The last third of this speech is 15 poems. Many times when this speech is translated, the poetry gets dropped out. People don't know what to do with it.
أتتركنا وقد كثرت علينا ذئاب الكفر تأكل من جناحي.
But because the poetry is dropped out, we haven't appreciated the extent to which this speech was not in fact a declaration of war as it was framed in the media at the time. It's more about the urgency of taking on the U.S., but in light of the far greater and important struggle, which was a struggle against Saudi corruption.
So in other words, this does change a bit about how we should see his message at that time and what he's trying to do. We've always been very fixated on the anti-Western side of it, perhaps too much.
The speech is an important moment in which we can see that there is a significant difference in the ways the media, in global media, would pick up what he had to say. I think there are significant differences between the ways this speech was intended to be received by listeners to this audio tape and the ways this speech got translated and picked up in news coverage.
You managed to play some of these cassettes to Osama bin Laden's son.
Yes, I was able to have a number of meetings with Omar bin Laden, and I played a number of the audio tapes for him. He found them interesting, but he was particularly moved by a tape that featured a group of men, Arab Afghan fighters, having breakfast together. This tape seems to be made by the cook himself, who's in a makeshift kitchen at a training camp.
So it's a glimpse of life on the front line, and they seem quite obsessed with food.
But more than that, they want good food. And they miss that. They miss Saudi cuisine, they say. And there's a famous cook in Mecca called Abu Nar, which is Mr. Hellfire, who makes these tasty, sweet desserts. And they yearn for Abu Nar's delicacies. Omar found this tape expressing what he said was the kind of dignity of the struggle of before the Soviets had left Afghanistan.
So this was made in the 80s?
That's right. And Omar said, after the Soviets withdrew, the struggle became far less clear and murkier. And it was at that point that he felt like everything began to fall apart. And his father picked up the wrong fight.
So from bin Laden's son, there was a kind of sadness that from this slightly collegiate, almost romantic notion of the jihad in the 80s against the Soviets came something which led to a very different place through the 90s and by 9/11.
That's right. After the Soviets left, there was no longer a clear front against an occupying infidel force. For bin Laden, ultimately, it was the United States, just a much messier new world order that opened the door to so many different perversions and distortions.
One of the last recordings in the collection is from the wedding of Osama bin Laden's bodyguard, Umar. What's the significance of that?
Yeah, this is a recording made in March of 2001, and it's the one tape in the collection that mentions Al-Qaeda in the sense that we know it today as an international militant organization led by bin Laden. Al-Qaeda's publicity committee sponsoring this tape. And the tape turns out to be a wedding by one of bin Laden's bodyguards. And he is celebrating primarily because he's going to leave the special bodyguard detachment and head home with his new wife back to Yemen. And all of his colleagues are saying, hey, you've been an amazing bodyguard, great colleague, but we wish you the best.
وهذه رسائل خاصة جدا جدا إلى عمر بن أبي عاصم.
So it's an interesting tape that Al-Qaeda chose to feature this wedding tape in which a bodyguard is actually leaving Al-Qaeda as a way to attract recruits, that you can join up with us and then leave and head home and choose to do something else with your life.
It's absolutely not what you'd think of in the months before 9/11 as an Al-Qaeda publicity message, is it?
Yeah, it's very interesting. And it says something about the challenges that Al-Qaeda was facing in recruiting people.
How does Osama bin Laden himself feature on that tape? Because he is now a wanted man, isn't he? I mean, the US are after him following the embassy attacks in 1998 in Africa. Is he audible on it?
There's a lot of mirth on the tape. Then bin Laden comes He talks about the ways in which celebration is important, but he also says not to let mirth overshadow the fact that there are more serious and austere issues at play here.
إلى انحسار المد الصليبي الأمريكي.
He then talks explicitly about a plan that he's aware of, and he doesn't reveal the details, but what he does say is, we are about to hear news, and ask God to grant our brothers success. I understand this to signify he was aware of the 9/11 attacks and that this was something that was on the horizon. He is specifically talking at that juncture about the United States. So it's a tape that, you suddenly are very keenly aware that there's a lot more going on than just what one hears at the wedding.
And when you look at the tapes, when you start with those first sounds of Osama bin Laden from the late 80s, and then you have this wedding tape just before 9/11, is there a sense of a clear, inevitable path from one to the other? This fighter in the 80s ends up planning the 9/11 attacks.
What's important and fascinating as I listen to these tapes is that there is nothing inevitable about 9/11 on these tapes. I was hard working on these tapes to remind myself of that. Much of my book talks about how there were many different possible outcomes of what happened, but the fact is that Al-Qaeda's primary enemies on most of these tapes, most of the time, are Muslim leaders themselves. Al-Qaeda's continued presence in Yemen, its effects in Iraq, and its ongoing devastation of the lives of Muslims in the Muslim world only confirms the fact that this organization, this idea, claims many bloody paths, and it's important to understand the ways in which Western audiences can and should recognize commonality with Muslims themselves.
The Bin Laden Tapes was presented by me, Gordon Carrera, and produced by Richard Fenton-Smith.
There are dozens of different podcasts now available from the BBC, including news, documentaries, science, business, arts and sport. For details of them all, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.